Welcome to the Gnostic Informant. I'm Jesus, the Logos incarnate, and you are about to attain true gnosis.
Testimonium Flavianum. It's the way that Josephus structures that entire paragraph is not the same way that Josephus structures other paragraphs. The way that he uses verbs in that section is kind of indicative of him not writing it. If you go to book 20 with the James reference, that's more likely an interpolation. Thrown off of a statue and stoned. On the other one, he was tossed off of a statue for proclaiming about Jesus. Later on in that passage, though, it talks about a Jesus ben Damnius being put into the same position that James was. We don't know where this James ben Damnius came from. We don't know why, he was put there instead of, somebody else. It ends up with you having to basically cherry pick which birth story you like better. Do you like the Moses birth story better than Luke's birth story, or do you like Luke? It's like some kind of Frankenstein monster of both nativity stories.
Welcome to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I also just want to say, what's up, heathens? How y'all doing?
Everybody, ever since I started doing that, people just absolutely love it.
I love it too. You can tell I watch you a lot.
Yeah. It's either people love it or they find it to be really cringy. So it's like, it's either, it's one of two extremes. So
yeah, those are just haters,
nice.
though.
Yeah.
So, Godless Engineer has a YouTube channel. If you don't know by now, most of my fans probably know. They probably do watch you. But just in case anyone doesn't know, he's out there. Go ahead and subscribe. And we're going to talk about some Christianity stuff, some historicity of Jesus, and other discrepancies in the text. I used to be a Christian, pretty hardcore Christian actually. I was what you would call a fundamentalist Christian, right wing, the whole nine. Like, and my course of my story basically was, I was so convinced that it was the truth that I was going to do basically what what's his author who from Case for Christ, Lee Strobel. I was going to do what he did. I was going to study, and I was going to put together a book, and I'm going to show the world how I know this is all true. So as I start to, sounds ridiculous. As I started doing that, the more I studied, the more I realized how it's completely false. Like I just had to be honest with myself. Like there's too many like loopholes, double standards, contradictions. It does not make sense. It doesn't. It's all about it's all about how you feel. You feel that it makes sense. And I actually, now that I'm looking back, I think the biggest reason was it's death. You're scared. People are scared to die. That's what religion is. I don't want to die, so I have to convince myself while I'm alive. I have to figure out a way to convince myself that it's all going to be okay and I'm going to go somewhere else when I die. To me, that's what it sums up to.
Well, I think that for Christianity, that is a pretty big part of it. And for, any of the religions that have sort of this afterlife notion in it, I think that probably that's a big motivating factor. If you look at the Old Testament, though, I don't really think that was all that much of a factor. I think it was more about providing some kind of control mechanism for the Israelite society and everything like that. So I think it started out as like sort of this method of control for the population of Israelites. And then, once we get to the first century, you end up with this idea of an afterlife, and they just sort of remold it into personal salvation rather than, keeping all of the Israelites, in check. It became more personal than, national, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I mean, like you said, the Old Testament is like a collective. It's the Jews are the chosen people. Everybody else is Gentiles, and we're all going to be good. Everyone else, stay away from them. Don't interbreed with them. and then you get to when you get to the New Testament, a lot of Christians don't even realize that they are diametrically opposed to each other in philosophy, and you got this law code, right? For the Jews, it's the 10 Commandments, but then you got the Deuteronomy code. It's like 613 laws, and they're supposed to follow those laws. And basically, Adam sinned, so the prophets are basically talking about, okay, we got these kings coming in and out, the north and the south, and there's righteous kings and then there's bad kings, and so you get this feeling of like a law code basically. But when you get to the New Testament, all of a sudden, forget about all that. Forget about the Levite priests. Forget about the Ark of the Covenant. That doesn't mean, even though there's literally hundreds and hundreds of pages dedicated to those concepts, just drop it. All you got to do now is have faith in Jesus. And by the way, It says Jesus was there in the beginning. In the beginning was the Logos, right? Okay, if he was there in the beginning, how come he's never mentioned to these Levite priests? They never. By the way, the high priest Jeshua or Zadok. I have to tell you something. There's this guy Jesus. He's my son. He's also with us. And just make sure you guys keep your faith in him, because that's the only thing that's going to matter in the end. Never tells him that. Just keeps him hanging until the Romans come along, and the Romans get it. They're the ones that figure it out, not the Jews. The ones that actually invented the Messiah term, the ones that are waiting for the Messiah, they're the ones that don't get it. But the Gentiles who don't even care about a Messiah, who are worshiping Zeus, Poseidon, they're the ones that are going to find the Messiah. So it's like, what?
Yeah, well, later Christians have actually went back through the Old Testament and identified, and this would be like first century Christians after the when they were developing the theology, how they say Jesus is the Word. Well, if you go back through the Old Testament, anytime, well, most of the time, not anytime, but most of the times when you see that, the word, or God sent the word, or the word told the prophet this, or something like that, Jesus is supposedly that intermediary between God and humans. And so like they sort of it's kind of a weird situation. What happened in the first century is that they did this reinterpretation of scripture,
right,
with the idea of this Messiah in mind, and considering that even Paul thinks of Jesus as this pre-existent celestial figure first, it makes total sense that they would identify the Word, or these different angels that interact with humans instead of God directly interacting with them. Because like another time, just to point it out, is when Gideon is selected in Judges. The word comes down to tell Gideon about it, and that word is supposedly Jesus, by that line of thought. So they what they did was they just reinterpreted the scriptures in order to see this Messiah figure like working all throughout Israelite history.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, yeah, they're drawing from the Old Testament to create a better New Testament, basically. But you can even see it in like the writings of Philo, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
He's basically getting the ball rolling for what becomes Christianity, in my opinion. He's talking about a logos that holds all the glue together. He says that the logos is the divine heir of the Father. He says that the God is of three, a nature of three. He's basically describing what is later going to be. He never mentions Jesus once, which to me, this is a really big, I would say this is huge for a mythicism standpoint, because here's a guy who's looking for this concept and talking about the same Messiah figure, basically. And he's in that area, in that time period. I mean, he lives in Alexandria, but he talks about going to the temple and being in Jerusalem. He's been there before, but he doesn't know who Jesus is. So it's like, wait a second. If he's there, he's talking about all the same stuff. How does he not even know about him? You know what I mean?
Right. That's a pretty good question. Now, Philo doesn't directly say like anything about I guess what we could consider the historical Jesus, but there is a section in his Logos where he mentions a Septuagint passage, and in that passage it identifies that Jesus will be that a Jesus will be this Messiah figure to come and bring salvation to everybody. So Philo developed independently of Paul. They both came to the same conclusion, being that Jesus is the Messiah. It's just that Philo was still a Jew, and he didn't think that the Messiah had come yet. But Paul, reading out of Scripture, thought that the Messiah had come, had died, and resurrected and absolved sins. And that's pretty much the difference between Philo and Paul. But the fact that both Philo and Paul can independently derive from Scripture this idea of a Jesus that's the Messiah that would die and resurrect and absolve sins and all this other stuff, I think is quite telling for the ambiguity that exists right now as to whether or not like a Jesus existed in the past. Because the way that I see it is that if you can derive the main story of Jesus out of the Old Testament, then what is there for us to be able to discern the Jesus of history from the Jesus that was constructed?
Right. And that's exactly what Philo is doing. Philo is drawing up an angelic being, basically a metaphorical Messiah that's not an allegorical Messiah. And he even writes about allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament. I don't even think he was looking. I mean, I don't know if maybe he was, but that's the one. I mean, that's what you're referring to, right? Is that he's talking about this?
Well, yeah, he's working on Hellenizing Judaism,
right.
Basically syncretizing Judaism with pagan concepts and ideas. And so the whole idea of the Logos and all that kind of stuff is, pagan.
Which we get, I was just going to say, we get those terms like Logos and even like Gnosis and Sophia. Those are all things from Pythagoreanism, Platonism. Philo even mentions in one of his books about Plato being divinely inspired. I mean, he's clearly trying to bring the two together. And,
right.
but it's like you said, those are all pagan ideas. So you got the Osiris cult. The resurrection is huge in that cult. You got the Mithra cult. You got the Dionysus cult. You got all these. You got the Eleusinian mysteries where Persephone dies and rises back up and saves everybody, and it's springtime. Same happened in, this is even older, but going back farther, you got Ishtar doing that in Babylon. And so this dying and rising pagan idea is already in the air around that time period. All it had to do was be Judaized, which Philo, I guess, is like sort of start, like I said before, he's sort of getting the ball rolling and putting these ideas out there for other people to look at that and give their own interpretation. So you can kind of see a natural progression of how Christianity formed, but not necessarily historical Jesus at all. Like that, you don't even hear about Jesus in the historical record until the late first century, outside of Paul, I should say. Outside of Paul does mention him obviously, but outside of Paul, you got the first one I think is Josephus, and then in the 90s, and then you hear all the time from Christians and even historicists that mention Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny the Younger. Those are all second century. Those are all 110s and 120s. That's almost 100 years after his life.
Yeah, well, so I got to push back a little bit because Josephus, I don't think originally mentioned Jesus at all. There's the one passage in Book 18 that's the Testimonium Flavianum, and there's several different points in which you can you can argue against it being there in the first place. Like, for instance, the way that Josephus structures that entire paragraph is not the same way that Josephus structures other paragraphs. The brevity of that section is also of concern. The way that he uses verbs in that section is also kind of indicative of him not writing it. That all comes from Paul Hopper's grammatical investigation into the Testimonium Flavianum. And then you got people like Alice Wheely who have done a sort of like a analysis of the lineage, I guess, of other versions of the Testimonium Flavianum that seem to be like the earlier redacted version, which would be the Arabic and Syriac versions.
Right.
But those actually trace back to Eusebius in the 3rd century, which is our current extant version. So
Right.
the only version that we've ever known is the highly Christianized version. And then if you go, and I can't remember the author, the historians' names now, but there's 2 different historians that came to the conclusion that the Testimonium Flavianum actually reads more like a Christian sometime around Eusebius or somebody like Eusebius that was creating this narrative. And then, that most likely they use the Emmaus Road story. I don't know if you're familiar with that story. It's found in, it's either Luke or Acts. It might be Luke, but the Emmaus Road story was actually used as the basic structure for the Testimonium Flavianum. And then after all of this, you've also got the fact that you can literally take that entire passage out and then sort of connect the passages around it together like puzzle pieces, and they fit exactly together like that.
You're talking about Josephus?
Yes, in Josephus.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm familiar with it. It's book 18. So he's talking about, first he's talking about Pilate, but not Jesus and Pilate. He's talking about Pilate slaughtering the Jews, which if that's a historical thing and the gospel writers are writing about Pilate, you would think they would put that in there. But they don't. They make Pilate sort of a good guy. Like, oh, what is truth? Like he's sitting there with Jesus being a philosopher. Like, no, he was slaughtering the Jews and he was bringing in statues and he was doing all types of shit that they did not like. So anyways, that's what they're writing about. And then you can see why they slipped it in there because it's about Pilate. But then the very next chapter goes into the problems that were happening in Rome with this girl who was worshiping Isis and how she gets raped. So Josephus is writing about like all this stuff that's happening, like all these like sort of like downfalls happening. But like in the middle of those two, you get randomly, like it's just randomly placed there. Oh, by the way, there's this guy named Jesus who died and rose again on the 3rd day, and he was the Messiah. What? He just literally inserts the Nicene Creed right in the text, the whole thing. So it's like I think most scholars at least agree that to some degree that there's an interpolation there. But I have no problem in accepting that the whole thing was just completely added. I mean, that makes sense to me. I'm not just saying that as a biased anti-Christian. Like that actually does make sense because it just doesn't belong there. It's just randomly put there. Right.
And then if you go to book 20 with the James reference, that's more likely an interpolation, because what you have is it says, James, the brother of Jesus, or brother of the Christ or whatnot. There's a lot of problems with Josephus writing that. For one thing, he doesn't mention anything about what a Christ is to the audience that he's writing to, and they wouldn't know what a Christ meant to the Jews and everything. Also, it's very curious about that section because, it was the Jews that got upset over James being killed. And it's like, that doesn't really mesh with what we quote unquote know about the James in the Bible, as far as the James that people think is the brother, because the Jews are the ones that killed James,
right. And not to mention that the two deaths are different. One of them he's in a different location in a different time period, and he's
thrown off of a statue and stoned. And the other one, a like Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin, which is a group of Jews, but they were convened and like false charges were filed against him, and then he was killed.
Right.
And it's like on the other one, it was he was tossed off of a statue for proclaiming about Jesus, and then killed by people. It's not like there was like a Sanhedrin that was called and they had like a court appearance and everything. Like it was not as elaborate as that. It was just, kick him off the statue and stone his ass. Sorry.
No, I don't care. Which makes you wonder if it's even the same James.
Well, yeah, it probably wasn't. But so later on in that passage, though, it talks about a Jesus ben Damnius being put into the same position that James was. And this doesn't make a lot of sense because we don't know where this James ben Damnius came from. We don't know why, he was put there instead of, somebody else. There's just no explanation given. But if you go back up to the top and you remove that who was called Christ, if you remove that out and then put something in there to reference James as being, ben Damnius or the son of Damnius or something like that, then the Jesus ben Damnius later on that is that is used to fill that role that James once filled, it makes a lot of sense because typically at that time, if somebody was killed, their family member or somebody close to them would take over their responsibilities, and so it makes a lot more sense. It's more parsimonious to consider the idea that maybe it was an interpolation, and it originally said something about it being ben Damnius. Another thing a lot of people don't think about is the fact that all of these books and letters and everything like that were hand copied, and so it was pretty pretty normal.
By Eusebius and the people working for Eusebius, right?
Well, yeah. Not only them, but people prior to them, right? That were writing, that were copying and maintaining good copies of these works. And so, like, errors happened, like mistakes happened, and so they would write these marginal notes in there. And so the next time the book would go and get copied, they would, fix the error. And so it looks like between Origen and Eusebius, somebody thought that it was an error, wrote in a marginal note, and then when it got copied again before Eusebius used it, it appeared there, and so it looks like it's an accidental interpolation rather than something that was rather than something that was intentional.
So all of this would sound sort of conspiracy theory-ish until you start reading about Eusebius and you find out that he was literally just making stuff up in his writings, in his histories. So you got a guy who's literally making stuff up. Like if we're in court and I'm on trial and I'm being questioned and I start lying, that's it for me. I'm no more a credible witness. I'm done. I can't even be taken seriously anymore. But for some reason, Eusebius is taken seriously. And it's not just one little lie here and there. He's making up stories that aren't even real. Like he's talking about Philo meeting Peter. Never happened. Talking about, and then this is the source that we get all these martyrdoms from. So we don't have anything from the martyrs. There's no talk about martyrdoms in the Bible. Okay. And we have writings that are later, supposedly, like Revelation, supposed to be way later. And he could have thrown in there our martyrs or did this or I mean, he does talk about people who were martyred, but he never mentions any like the names, right? He could have done that, but whatever. Long story short, this is where the sources for all these martyrs that Christians are like, these people wouldn't, do you think they would get martyred if they didn't believe it was real? Well, it's like, well, your source is from 325 AD. How do you know they really were martyred? And it's the same guy who lied about other stuff.
Right. And Eusebius even rewrote his own church history about like 4 times or something like that. So, I mean, he's no stranger to making stuff up and fabricating things in order to strengthen his own position. But as far as like the Josephus passages go, I think that somebody like Eusebius, the Testimonium Flavianum, and then the James passage, I think, was an accidental interpolation. And in order to argue around that, you'd actually have to specially plead, because you'd have to say, oh no, this definitely wasn't like a scribal error or an accidental interpolation. And like there's no way to say, oh, it definitely wasn't that. And I'm not saying that as like an argument from silence, like, oh, unless you can prove it wrong, then it's right. I'm just saying that if you make those changes, if you look at it from an interpolated point of view, the passage makes more sense than
Right.
as it exists now. And so you'd have to try to explain how the passage now makes more sense than altered, like what I would perceive as back to the original. And so far, I found the arguments for that particular position to be very unconvincing. So, in my point of view, outside of Paul, nobody ever mentions Jesus in the first century whatsoever.
You could be. I probably would agree with that. It's and then like, okay, so even if we did grant Josephus to be a little bit true, like let's say it's interpolation, but like let's say he does mention him, could be true, right? Could be possible.
Mhm.
We're still talking about 96 AD. We're almost in, like, it's no different than Tacitus hearing a story from somebody and writing it. He wasn't there. This is not a primary source. This is almost second century anyway. So like,
Right.
so, and it's like, the reason why I bring that up is because you got Philo, you got Pliny the Elder, you got Seneca, you got people around during that time period who were writing about all the same subjects. Pliny's talking about deified people, resurrections. He even mentions people who resurrected. He doesn't mention Jesus. Prodigal births. He's talking about miracles. He's writing about all these subjects. He's writing about the Essenes, which are supposedly the people who became the followers of Jesus, supposedly. And so you have clear cases of people who were there and don't even if they hated him, like you see in all the time, people hate Donald Trump. They talk about him all the time. It doesn't matter if you hate him or not. You're going to talk about him, especially if he's claiming to be a Messiah. And so you don't even have one thing, not even like a scrape on a rock or something. Nothing. There's zero. So you got the guy who says that he's the Messiah of the world, whether he's historical, whether it's real or just some guy who pretends to be the Messiah. You would think he would leave something. Hi, I'm Jesus. I'm the Messiah. You should follow me. Nothing. Zero.
Right. Well, that's why I consider Paul actually to be the best hope for a historical Jesus, because he's early. He's writing in the 50s, and then some of his letters gets into the 60s, but his earliest attestation to this Jesus is in the 50s,
Right.
and he says that he's been a Christian for a while, and but why I think that he's probably their best hope, or the best hope for historical Jesus, is that there's a number of ambiguous passages in Paul. And I think that you can make an argument that Paul thought that Jesus walked on earth, but I find those arguments to be weak, for one. For two, I often find that a lot of people end up making up information that is not found in the evidence. Like, the first thing that comes to mind is that they say that, well, Paul knew disciples of Jesus, and then of course there's Paul knew the brother of Jesus, but we can get to that in a second if we want to. But one of the most common things is, well, Paul knew disciples of Jesus, so obviously Jesus was a real person on earth. But the problem is that Paul never mentions the word disciple whatsoever, and nor does he indicate anybody as being in the ministry of Jesus or walking and talking with Jesus. It's only apostles that he references, and the only thing that apostle means, as far as Paul is concerned, is that you read the scriptures about Jesus and you got a vision of Jesus.
Right.
And so there's literally no historical connection with Paul as far as he says, but you could make, albeit a weak argument, you can make an argument for historicity from Paul, but I think that that's really about it.
And once again, he wasn't even there. He supposedly was alive during the time of Jesus, but his first interaction with Jesus is the ghost Jesus. So it's like, once again, your closest source wasn't even there. But he comes off to me, and I'm just speculating here, this is not based off any scholarship or anything. He comes off to me as like somebody who's trying to hijack a movement for his own good. Like he's taking a Jewish cult and bringing it to Greece and Turkey and sort of being like, I was there, guys. Look, I'm the real apostle. Don't listen to these guys. Listen to me. You don't have to eat that pork. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do that. You don't even have to get circumcised. Just be my friend. Like that's what he comes off. That's how he comes off to me. It seems like he's like being desperate to sort of hijack a movement that's already happening.
Maybe, but I think that that Paul is more schizotypal than he is, possibly a fraudster, and I don't typically try to ascertain whether or not Paul was lying or if he was trying to, hijack the movement, like you say. But what we do know from Paul's writings is that he was having hallucinations of Jesus. And just one thing to point out is that when Paul hallucinated Jesus and he experienced Jesus, it wasn't like Paul was a ghost, or not Paul, but Jesus. It wasn't like Jesus was a ghost. The idea of celestial beings in Judaism, which Paul was a Jew, even when he was preaching Jesus, he was still a Jew. The idea of celestial beings was very corporeal, and this is very integral to understanding what Paul believed, because with Paul saying that he had these visions of Jesus, what he really meant was that he got these visions of a celestial Jesus. Now, celestial beings physically exist in this reality. The firmament, just like right above the firmament, right on top of the firmament, is like the first layer of heaven. Like that's a celestial plane where things exist, and most notably demons and Satan. They all existed on the firmament. And then you've got the different levels of heaven, which is it actually in some Jewish theologies, there was actually about 7 levels of heaven that you could traverse. And so Paul thought of Jesus as a physical thing, like a physical being, but he was celestial. And all of the events that Jesus tells him about occurred in this celestial realm that was lower than the highest heaven that God would be in. It's lower than that, but it's still like not on earth. Is as far as we can understand Paul, that's how he kind of perceives Jesus's sacrifice. Jesus's whole passion is enacted in that area, and there's several different ways that we know this. Like for one thing, Paul blames the quote unquote archons of this aeon, and that's a very curious phrase to use when you're describing the powers or the group that killed Jesus, because he could have just as easily said the Romans, or indicated anybody that was actually on earth, but he says archons of this aeon. Now, the celestial being that Paul, as well as other Jews, considered to be the king of this world, or the ruler of the air, or the ruler of this age, which are all synonymous with the archons of this aeon, was Satan.
Right.
And so it makes a lot more sense to view Paul through that lens of, a corporeal Jesus coming down and to the firmament and being crucified by Satan and his demons, and then ascending back up into heaven in order to accomplish everything he was supposed to, rather than, really contorting and convoluting what Paul says in order for it to mean a historical person on earth. And so there's more specific verses that we could get into. Another thing that I want to mention is that the time period between when Jesus supposedly existed and when we actually have writings about him is not all that it's not all that surprising, because like if you just take Alexander the Great, our best biography about Alexander the Great doesn't come for 400 years after he dies.
But that's not to say that there wasn't one in circulation before that. That just means that's when the last one, you know what I mean?
Well, Well, yeah, yeah. Well, I was going to point out that on this, like, because this is a common talking point that people will give you, is that, well, Alexander the Great, his biography was written 400 years later.
Right.
But if you actually take a look at the biography, if you take a look at the sources that were used for it, they were firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great. Yeah, they were generals and they were enemies and things like that.
Exactly.
That were firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great doing the things that he was supposedly doing.
Not only that, there's writing on stone in Babylon that in Greek from people writing, Alexander and his army were here. Can you give me one thing like that regarding Jesus? No. That's all. No. There's a big difference right there.
No, yeah, exactly. And that's the big difference. And that's the thing that if anybody ever gives you shit about it or anything like that, that's the thing that you need to point out, is that those people that were writing hundreds of years later were using contemporaneous firsthand accounts that, while we don't have access to them now, doesn't mean that they didn't have access to them. And so we know about these firsthand accounts through Arian, who was using them to compose his biography. Now, if we jump to Jesus, we literally have nothing like this at all.
Right.
Like we don't have any credible eyewitness accounts of him. We don't have any credible contemporaneous accounts that talk about him being on Earth.
You mentioned Arian. That could have been Philo. Philo could have been the Arian for Jesus, but he didn't write anything. That would have been perfect.
Exactly.
He was the prime candidate, or at least, or maybe Pliny the Elder. Nothing. Not even a name. Not even like, oh, there's a guy named Jesus. Nothing. Zero.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And another thing I noticed, you're talking about Paul. Unless you weren't finished. I think I jumped in. Were you finished?
Oh no. I mean, I think I covered the things that I wanted to.
I do that a lot. I'm sorry. But,
no, it's fine.
So when you're reading Paul, I didn't notice this at first, because the way the Bible's set up is the Gospels are first and then Paul's later. So you kind of get the feeling that Paul's writing after. But when you start to actually look into it, you find out the Gospels are written later. Probably all of them past 70 at least, I think. But then that makes you realize, hold on a second. If Paul's writing first, then why is he forgetting? Why is there such a disconnect between the narratives in the Gospels and Paul's narratives? It's almost like he doesn't even know the Gospels. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, I was going to say the only overlaps between Paul and the Gospels are the things that were syncretized between Hellenistic pagan ideas and Judaism. And that would be concepts like baptisms. That would be concepts like resurrection, apocalyptic sort of imagery, and a divine opponent of God. And resurrection. I don't know if I've already said that or not.
Yeah, no, those are all things that are not mentioned at all in the Old Testament. There's no baptism in the Old Testament. I don't even think the word resurrection's even in there.
No, well, I mean, in the concept of resurrection is definitely in the Old Testament, and that's the reason why those all of those things were able to be syncretized in, using Judaism, because basically you had all of these concepts going around, like resurrection and all that other kind of stuff. And what the first century Christians or Jewish Christians did was they looked at their own religion and were able to reinterpret things into those concepts. And so, like in the Old Testament, you have several times where there's somebody that gets resurrected. I know one guy he fell into a hole and died, and then but he touched the bones of Elijah, either Elijah or Elisha.
Elisha, yeah, the second one.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he just popped back. He was resurrected.
Right.
He came back to life. And if you can read the suffering servant, Isaiah 52 and 53, and you definitely have a clear indication of a death and resurrection sort of type of thing. So while they don't use that specific word resurrection, they definitely have those concepts that you can tell how they took those ideas from the Old Testament and merged them with the Hellenistic ideas, and
Absolutely.
then Christianity.
Well, it's funny. I'm glad you brought that up, because this is another big point, is like the narratives in the Gospels are drawing from the Old Testament. You mentioned Elisha.
Mm-hmm.
So they compared John the Baptist to Elijah being the forerunner of someone that's going to be, I think, what do they say, twice as greater or something like that? But
I can't remember that part.
But either way, there's some being greater, right? They actually have
Right.
a portion. And if you actually look back at, I think it's 2 Kings, when Elisha takes over and becomes the successor of Elijah, he asks Elijah, before Elijah ascends into heaven, he asks to have double of his power, and Elijah gives it to him. So Elisha, the one that you just talked about being even more powerful, he's raising people from the dead. He's bones, like you said, his bones being touched brought someone back to life. So you got a clear picture of Elijah and Elisha, and then in the New Testament you got John the Baptist and then Jesus. Well, that's one example. Then you got the Joseph narrative. Joseph gets sold for 20 shekels. Jesus gets sold for 30 shekels. Joseph has his 12 brothers, or 11 brothers. Jesus has his 12 disciples. So there's sort of like a connection there. And then you got the being the only begotten son about to be killed by Abraham. That's like a picture of Jesus. And there's all these pictures of Jesus in the Old Testament. And you can see where they're drawing all these concepts from. When you take all that away, what are you left with? Almost nothing.
Well, so interesting you bring all this up. There's a good book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms. If you haven't read it, definitely read it because it'll blow your mind. But in it, he directly connects through textual analysis that the Elisha and Elijah miracles, all of them are copied by Jesus. And
There you go.
yeah, well, and like I'm actually working on a video right now for my channel where an actual New Testament scholar gets a lot of things turned around. But one of the things he mentions is when Jesus stills the seas. And that's an interesting one because the gospel writers, they got that from the book of Jonah, but the book of Jonah got it from Psalms 107. And so it's like a piggybacking.
3 days in the well too.
Yes, actually, that's Matthew, I believe, makes that direct connection. That's the reason why Jesus is dead for 3 days, is because just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days.
Well, he even tells him, "I'll give you no sign except for the sign of Jonah."
Mm-hmm.
They ask him for a sign.
Exactly.
It's so obvious. It's everywhere. Yeah. And then even so, well, go ahead. You're saying something?
Oh, well, I was just gonna say that doesn't really concern Elisha and Elijah, but like the miraculous generation of food, you've got Mark with the 2 different loaves and fish stories, and then in John you've got the water to wine stuff. All of those things are taken from the Elisha Elijah narrative. So with the water to wine, that is also another version of this miraculous generation of food, because you have, this water, and then Jesus, miraculously produces wine from it. Now there's like the current video that I'm working on, the guy makes it out to be like, oh, well, mythicists say that they get this from Dionysus because Dionysus was the god of wine and all this other stuff. And it's like, not exactly. It's more likely that it's just another version of the, miraculous generation of food. And so, I mean,
Euripides Bacchae does have a passage that's very similar to the wedding at Cana, where he's at a wedding and he says that I'm the true vine. So, that's Dr. Dennis McDonald, who I did a video with, who explains that very well. But that's beside the point. That's just like, they could have been looking at both. Like, I think it's more drawn from what you're talking about.
Well, yeah. So I'm not saying that there's no pagan influence, but I guess the point that the guy in the video that I'm responding to is trying to make is that it's not pagan whatsoever.
Right.
And because he says that, oh, if it was pagan, then why didn't they go full pagan and be like it was Dionysus or something? And that just really wouldn't make sense, because
Right.
in order, just like with the syncretism of resurrection and the hellscape that apparently exists, like all of that, it has to coincide with some kind of existing Jewish belief. And so it only makes sense that, well, you got this miraculous generation of food, here's another miraculous generation of food, kind of thing. And I don't know if there's any kind of pagan influence on it. There may have been. There's a strong connection between, like, Dionysus is a dying and right. I think Dionysus is a dying and rising.
Yeah, he dies. He gets killed by the Maenads, and he gets resurrects. When he resurrects, this is fresh in my mind. I just listened to the audiobook of this. He resurrects, and he goes back to the people who basically they chained him up. He went through this huge long process. It was like basically a what do you call it? A passion. It's just like a very similar, and he even like this. It starts off, the Son of God has entered the world. Like there's all these really themes that really sound really Christian. But anyways, when he does resurrect, when he comes back, they all go, oh, "This is the Son of God," and he says, "It's too late. You didn't worship me." He said, "And the wages of sin is death," and that's the end of it. That he ends judging them for not believing in him. He doesn't care about anything else except for them believing in him. What does that sound?
Well, yeah. Well, and Justin Martyr, in about the mid 2nd century, he actually mentions how the whole passion and resurrection and everything about Jesus is no different than those that the pagans call the sons of Zeus, and just the other pagan gods. So, I mean, with the fact that the authors of the Gospels of all these books, I mean, they had to go. Even Paul had to go to pagan schools in order to write Greek, right? To read and write in Greek, which is what they all wrote in. They had to go to pagan schools. And so they were influenced by these pagan ideas, these pagan concepts, and everything like that. So that's another thing that a lot of people don't consider, is the fact that in these pagan schools where they were teaching them how to read and write Greek, that they were also teaching them to mimic older stories in order to create new ones. And that people people that push back against mythicism, they usually don't consider that fact, or they'll specially plead. They'll act like, oh, they existed in a vacuum, or they weren't influenced, or they'll come up with some kind of excuse to separate them from pagan ideals.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the Son of God was so common in paganism. Alexander the Great was called the Son of God. He was called son of Ammon in Egypt. He was called son of Zeus in Greece. You got Julius
Romulus.
Caesar. Yeah, Romulus. Romulus is a really good example too. But Julius Caesar gets deified, and then Augustus is called, like, it was on coins in circulation. I'm showing it now on the screen. There's literally coins that say Divius Ilius, son of God, on the coin. And on one side of the coin is Augustus's face. On the other side of the coin, it's the Star of Ishtar, or I'm sorry, Star of Venus, that little X. It looks like, but like it's like that was so prevalent in the time period. It was just in the air. Like that's just like that's what religion was. And not even in Judaism. The sons of God have allied themselves in front of Jehovah. In the book of Job, it says that. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and this is even reflected in the Gospel of Mark. The Jews were very adoptionist. So, anytime anybody was crowned, I guess rightfully crowned, king of Israel or whatnot, he was considered to be a son of God. He was inducted into the family of God. Christianity took it out of like the realm of only for the king and made it available to everybody, so that when you get baptized, you are now you symbolically experience the death of Christ and are washed clean through Christ's death and are resurrected anew. and that's how you're sin free or whatnot. You're essentially in the family of God at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting because, and on the other side, on the pagan side, when you're adopted, especially like if you're adopted by Caesar, you become the Caesar. Like Caligula was adopted by who was before Caligula? Whoever the emperor was before Caligula, and he wasn't really his son, but he became his son. No, I'm sorry, it's Tiberius. That's what it was. Tiberius adopts Caligula, and then he becomes Caesar in the same way that Augustus wasn't really Julius Caesar's son. He was adopted. So in the ancient world, you were adopted into things. It became like set in stone. Like you were like part of that bloodline, even if you weren't for real.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's some other sources that Christians like to point to, and they're just completely bunk. Like, for example, Mara Bar Sarabian, I wrote this down, that he writes about the death of Socrates, the death of Pythagoras, and then he says, the death of the wise king of the Jews. And then they're like, that's Jesus. It's like, wait a minute, hold on a second. Jesus wasn't even a real king. That was a mocking. They were mocking him as a king, as a fake king. So why would somebody write about the king of the Jews being wise, but he's not really the king? So that can't. Right. So that's a completely bunk source. And then the other ones I like to point out is Celsus and Thales. And the Celsus is like in the 2nd century. He's talking about some Jesus, a sorcerer. And then Thales, there is no source. It's just Eusebius talking about a source. So we got Eusebius again, another Eusebius. So it's like, okay, that's all you have. That's it.
Right. And I mean, even in the portions of Thales that we do have, however third or fourth hand that they may be, it never mentioned, like it only tries to record an earthquake and a solar eclipse or something like that, I believe, supposedly around the time of Jesus. But the problem is that they never place those particular events anywhere near Judea or Jerusalem or anything like that. And so people have to interpret into the text that is talking about Jesus.
You have to reach miles for that. Because like that's another thing. It's like if they'll say, oh, he's referencing when Jesus died on the cross, it says in Matthew that, there was earthquakes and all this crazy stuff happened. It's like, okay, if that really happened, somebody would have wrote about it in Judea. Like, this was a crazy day. They crucified this guy, and all of a sudden, all these crazy things started happening. There was earthquakes. Zombies were risen from the dead. And literally, like, come on. Like, even Christians, like William Lane Craig is like, that might be true. It might be a little bit of literary extra.
Well, yeah. Mike Licona said that was like a metaphorical or apocalyptic imagery, and like he lost 2 jobs and several speaking engagements.
That's what's going to happen, though. That's what all Christians are going to have to do. Is they're going to have to just write everything off as just literary devices and metaphors, and I mean that's all you really can do, or you become a full-blown conspiracy theorists, and NASA's lying, the scientists are lying, the world's 6,000 years old, it's flat. Like, that's your only other option, because either it's all a lie or it's a metaphor, or are you just going to be a liar? You're just going to go back and forth between truth and what you want to be truth.
Right. And, a majority of like the New Testament scholars, the scholars that people regularly tout out, like William Lane Craig and Mike Licona, Craig Blomberg, Dr. Craig Evans, Gary Habermas, they're all controlled by statements of faith. So in order for them to keep their job, they have to agree in the magical Jesus, not just a historical like Jesus existed, but a magical Jesus. But this reach even extends out far outside of that, because what you have is this whole community that is majorly controlled by statements of faith and this Christian line that people have to toe. And so what that ends up doing is it reaches out to even atheist New Testament scholars, and atheist people that are not necessarily New Testament scholars, but just like John W. Loftus. he felt for the longest time that Jesus most likely didn't exist. But because he feared not being taken seriously, and he feared being ridiculed, and he feared, not being able to like
Seriously.
support himself, that he had to toe the line for the longest time until he was established enough to where he felt comfortable, saying that he doubts the historicity. And he only recently did that. So it's amazing to me how far people will go, because a lot of people tout out these different scholars and everything like that say, oh well, obviously Jesus existed. This is an absurd question. But it's like everybody that says it's absurd or ridiculous has either been told by a New Testament scholar that it's absurd, or are New Testament scholars themselves that have to consider it absurd, like contractually.
Yeah. No, I mean, look at what's going on with Richard Carrier. People ridicule him. He's a fringe scholar. And it's like, the dude has written books about the subject, and he's thorough with it. He's always factual. He's not out in left field. He makes perfect sense when he says what he says. And like, the only argument you hear against him is, well, scholarship doesn't agree with him. Or Bart Ehrman didn't say, Bart Ehrman doesn't agree with him, so he must be wrong. That's not an argument. What do you like? Let me hear why he's wrong. Tell me why you think he's wrong. They don't say anything. It's just, scholarship just doesn't agree. That's okay. I've heard that a million times, but let me hear something. Because that's the one thing that I will say. Because if you take out all this stuff that we were talking about, you take out all the stuff they drew from the Old Testament, you take out all the stuff that they draw from pagan ideals, you take out all the, basically all the narratives, and you're left with a guy named Jesus from Nazareth, possibly, or Bethlehem, which brings me to the last point. And this is the big one. This is the one that I think has historicism hanging on by a nice little thread. This is their last final thread, in my opinion, besides Josephus, is why would they mention that he's Jesus of Nazareth if he was born in Bethlehem? I think it's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, but luckily I have an answer.
Let's hear it.
Well, so our clearest indication comes from Matthew. Matthew claims that Jesus comes from Nazareth due to some kind of prophetic word in the Old Testament, in the scriptures. And so we don't know exactly where that is. There is one particular reference, I think it's in Micah, where it talks about how the Messiah will be called the branch or whatnot. And
yeah. That's in Zechariah and Micah, I think.
Yeah, Christians have interpreted that as meaning from like Jesse or from Nazareth. They've connected it to Nazareth or something like that. But
that's a good point.
Yeah, so there's the Nazareth connection, which I don't think that we have the original scripture where it explicitly states, the Messiah would come from Nazareth or whatnot. I think that's a little bit of a stretch to say that right there is an indication, but it still could be, definitely. We just simply don't know. But,
so wait, is that what the word Hebrew for branches is? It close to, like, is that what you're saying, or?
No. It's not that the word is close to it. It's like because the branch symbolizes Jesse, or it's connected to Jesse.
The root of Jesse.
Right, the root of Jesse, and apparently Jesse is connected to Nazareth in some kind of way. Oh. And so that's how I've heard it explained, how that means that he'll be called Nazarene or from Nazareth. Because
there's also in I think it's Numbers or Deuteronomy. It's one of those Torah. There's original 5 books. It's they talk about the Nazarite vow, and it makes me when I first found out about this Nazarite vow thing, and how it's like you have to take this vow where you can't cut your hair and you have to wear certain clothes and you can't do certain things. You have to be like extra hardcore Jew for like 7 years or something. And it's like, it made me wonder if that's where the connection for him being a Nazarene would be. Because in the Talmud, which I know this is way later, but the Jesus in the Talmud is Nazarite. The Nazarite.
Right.
Like, wait a second. Is this what they're talking about? Is he being a Nazarite? And that could give you a little answer right there.
Right. So the Jesus mentioned in the Talmud actually existed about 100 years.
Yeah, he's like a totally different Jesus. Right.
Yeah, but it shows that there's that you know that there still exists. I don't know about today, but there existed for the longest time this Christianity that was totally separated from the Christianity that was set up in like Jerusalem and all that. And it was I can't remember all the specifics right now, but like that particular portion of the Talmud shows you that there was this whole idea of a Jesus sort of figure in that area that was called the Nazarite,
The Nazarite.
or the Nazorian, or
Which,
whatever.
which
Yeah,
if he's called a Nazarite, that doesn't mean he's from anywhere. That just means he's a Nazarite. It could be from
Right.
anywhere. You could be a Nazarite in Bethlehem. You could be a Nazarite in freaking Egypt if you want, because that's just
Right.
a vow.
right. And so that's where Nazareth comes from, and then where Bethlehem comes from is a direct scriptural reference that we still have. But I mean, like I said, Matthew makes it all very plain. Like Matthew is the gospel that really heavily references the Old Testament a lot, because for the entire story of Jesus's birth and where he comes from and everything like that, he continuously references the Old Testament scriptures. And so, being that Matthew's Jesus birth story is actually a mirror of the Moses birth story, it would make sense that for whatever reason they had to reconcile two different prophetic words about Jesus's birth, that he was born in Bethlehem, but he was hailed as coming from Nazareth.
That makes
And
sense.
so they had to figure out a way to reconcile that. And so what we get is what happens in Matthew and Luke. And Matthew's solution is to make him out to be the new Moses. And so he has a very Moses-y birth story that ends up with him being in Nazareth.
Which, by the way, Luke and Matthew have two different genealogies. They don't. And,
Yes.
and I've heard Christians, especially my old pastor, used to say, "Well, one of them's Mary and one of them's Joseph." No, they both say Joseph, and they're both different. They both literally say Joseph in the actual and so they'll say, "Well, that's how they wrote genealogies. Even if it's Mary, they're still going to write Joseph." No, they don't do that. They wouldn't do that. You wouldn't write a genealogy for Mary and then put her husband's name where her name should be. You wouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So both genealogies are supposedly for Joseph and Jesus, but they have different names, like they're totally different. They're not even a little bit different. They're completely different.
Right. And it also doesn't make sense whatsoever, being that God is the one that impregnated Mary. So it's like Joseph's the stepfather. Like,
right.
There's no reason for Joseph to even be in this genealogy. Like that.
Yeah. Why even have a genealogy if he's a son of God? That's such a good point that never gets talked about. It really is.
Yeah.
But we're about to close out, but I do want to make one more point. Are you familiar with Mike Lawrence?
Mike Lawrence. I haven't heard the name.
I had him on here. He's a mythicist, and he kind of blew my mind. He has some really good points. The biggest point that we haven't talked about that he talks about is the number 70. So that if the temple fell in 70 AD and Jesus is born in the year 0, now Daniel talks about 70 years being decreed from the Messiah to the fall of Jerusalem. So all of a sudden you're like, wait a second. They're taking from Daniel and they're inserting the Messiah on the year 0 and starting that off as the year 0. I mean, I know that date didn't start till later, but regardless, they're saying 70 years from whoever's writing about this has to be after the year 70. So it's like, I don't know if Paul doesn't really talk about the fall of Jerusalem. Paul could be talking about what Philo was talking about, just some Jesus in heaven. But now later on, when this is getting interpreted differently through evolution of Christianity, they're looking at when to place a historical Jesus, and they inserted him in the year 0, which would give him 70 years before the fall of Jerusalem, which is like, wow, that's a really good point. So
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, considering that our Gregorian calendar was, created by a pope and by Pope Gregory, and the calendars have been regulated and everything like that by some kind of religious authority. I think that it totally makes sense for a religious leader, which I don't know this for certain, but it totally makes sense for a religious leader to, see, to know when, Rome or Israel fell, or Jerusalem fell, whatever, to know when that happened, and then, use Jesus's coming or whatnot in saying 70 years before that, because, we now know that the dates for Jesus's birth, if you were to go by gospel standards, was either 4 BCE or 6 AD. So those are the two different birth possible years.
The reason why being 4 BC is because it has to be for Herod to be alive and for him to be baby, because Herod dies in 4 BC. And then the 6 AD, I think, is because he gets baptized in the 14th year of Tiberius, something like that.
Well, yeah. So
it can't be both.
Well, so as far as the birth goes, I don't know. I don't know the accuracy of that particular way, but the way that I've always come about it is that when it talks about Jesus being born, it talks about a census under Quirinius, and the only census that occurred around that time was in 6 AD.
Oh, okay.
And the only difference is that they didn't require, like, it's a weird requirement to have you go back to the home of your ancestral birth, or your ancestral home or something like that. That's kind of a weird place to have people trek and go and to do a census.
Right.
That's not normally how censuses occurred at that time, so right. it kind of seems weird. I think that was made up in order to give a reason for them having to go to Bethlehem in order for Jesus to be born.
And that's another thing, is the dates all contradict each other, because it says I think it's Luke, or it's in one of the Gospels, maybe Mark, it says that he gets baptized in the 14th year of Tiberius. So now you have a date right there. We know the 14th. I think they did math, and they said if he was born in 4 BC and baptized in the 14th year of Tiberius, he'd be like 35 already, like 37 years old. It was something like that. So it's like that throws everything off. He's supposed to be 30 at his baptism. So it's like now it's just so many contradictions that you have to just give the whole thing up. I think you just have to.
Well, I mean, you've got it ends up with you having to basically cherry pick which birth story you like better. Do you like the Moses birth story better than Luke's birth story, or do you like Luke? I've seen a lot of people go with Luke's birth narrative, and a lot of times, since we're kind of coming up on Christmas season, a lot of the times when you see the nativities out there and everything like that, it's like some kind of Frankenstein monster of both nativity stories in the Bible, and it's really it's so weird. Especially I advise everybody either this year or every year, something like that, every year around this time, just go through and read the different birth narratives in the Bible, because they're so wildly different that it's really crazy to think they're saying the same thing.
Yeah, it really is. And this has been fun, and like I said in the beginning, if you haven't subscribed to Godless Engineer, go ahead and do that. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.